Hey everybody, welcome. We are delighted to have an opportunity to share some information and some scenes about this really spectacular play we have the privilege of doing called The Whipping Man. Before we get into that though, first allow me to introduce to you these fine folk who are sharing this table with me. Right next to me is Dr. Richard Blackett, Andrew Jackson Professor of History at Vanderbilt University. So yay, Richard. And next to him is Rabbi Shana Mackler from the temple. Yay, Shana! Shana's actually been consulting with us all along, helping us learn to speak Hebrew and other such Jewish things. And so I've decided that she's my rabbi, even though I'm not actually Jewish. One of the things that we always look for when we're choosing our programming at Nashville Rep is to make sure that we choose material that is in some way really stimulating and nourishing and really intriguing. These are the kinds of things we look for. And when The Whipping Man by Matthew Lopez started being done by a lot of theaters in the country, it really caught my attention and I paid attention to it. This play started in New York in 2011 and since then has sort of rolled across the country as regional theaters across the country have picked up on it. And it's actually wildly popular. This year it's going to be one of the most produced plays in regional theaters in the United States. And I think, you know, one of the reasons that has happened is because there is a really great, first and foremost, there's a really great story being told in this play, but it's also being told with a unique twist. And there's some, there are elements about it that I think are relatively unique to plays being done. So the playwright, Matthew Lopez, an extremely young man, frankly, to be writing such a smart play, he actually has spoken about how he wrote this play out of a couple of impulses. One is he's a really deeply interested in Civil War history, and he describes that he had sort of this interesting eureka moment when in his studies he noticed that at the fall of the Confederacy in April of 1865, and specifically the fall of Richmond, actually happened during Passover. And so he was intrigued by the juxtaposition of this moment when American African slaves were being freed with the story of the Israelites being freed from Egyptian slavery in the story of the Exodus. So he thought that was a really interesting juxtaposition, and he began to wonder what it might be like if, in the same way that slaves often adopted the Christian faith of their owners over generations in the American South, that what if Jewish slave owners had the same experience with the slaves that they owned, that those slaves actually also adopted the Jewish faith. And he made that leap as a way of trying to sort of find a really interesting way to have a story bounce off of each other about slavery and freedom and what does it mean. And it turns out to be a really interesting way to have that conversation. I think he has said that when he wrote the play, he didn't really know if that had actually happened, and that's one of the things that we'll get Shana to talk to us about as well. But it was a launching point for a really great story. So the story is actually set. The play is set in Richmond, 1865, in April, right after the fall of the city. And of course, April was a big month for the Civil War. Not only did the siege of Petersburg end, but Richmond fell. Obviously, the Appomattox surrender happened, and then, of course, Abraham Lincoln was also assassinated in that month. So he sort of focused on this sort of whirlwind of activity that happened right on that weekend that was also Passover in April of 1865. So when the play opens, you see the sort of bombed out townhouse that was formerly the De Leon families here in Richmond. When the city fell, it was almost destroyed. There was lots of fires and looting, and so this house has been recently all the furniture's been stolen, and it's just a bombed-out shell of a house. The first thing we see is the return of Caleb De Leon, who is the young Confederate soldier, who is the young man of the household, and he's come back to discover that the house is virtually empty. He's not sure where his family has gotten to, but there are two slaves, now former slaves, that are still in the area. Simon is the slave who was actually the main house slave of this house, and he's still taking care of the house for reasons that we find out about in the course of the play. And then later, John shows up, and John is a young man who's Caleb's age, more or less, and we find that they were sort of raised together in this household. We also find out immediately that Caleb has been shot and he has not had that wound taken care of, and now his leg is gangrenous. So Simon has to break the news to him that he has to have his leg amputated. Makes for a really interesting first scene. You're not going to want to miss it. The first scene that we're going to do for you right now, though, to launch this conversation, we're sparing you the amputation. So when you see Matthew up on the stage, imagine that he only has one leg. And they're basically at the point now, it's the day after the amputation has taken place, and because they're so, the food is scarce, the horse that Matthew was rode in on has died. They rode him to death, essentially, and they have butchered this horse, and they're having a meal. And so this scene that we're going to do for you is in scene 3 of the first act, in which they're sitting around having a meal, and conversation falls to the discussion of their faith. So please help me say hello to our 3 actors, Matthew Rosenbaum, James Rudolph, and Eddie George. If you guys would go ahead and jump up front here.
John, did you say today was April 14th?
It is.
You know that puts us at Passover.
Imagine that. Couldn't come at a better time.
Comes every year at this time.
You know what I'm talking about.
I think he's talking
I know
about
what he means.
the fact that here we are this year. Where we are this year, in the middle of all we are this year, and Pesach happening at the same time.
Why is this year different from our other years?
It's a miracle, is what it is. Caleb, I noticed you weren't saying the blessing with us when we were praying.
So?
You forget your Hebrew?
No.
So what then?
I'm just not big on praying these days, Simon.
Since when? Caleb?
Since Petersburg.
Why?
It's not important.
I'd like to know.
I said it's not important.
Yes, but still I'd
It's
like to know.
because I was at Petersburg and he most decidedly was not.
God is not fond of fair weather friends, Caleb.
I don't need a sermon, Simon.
Sermon Simon.
No, you don't need a sermon, and you ain't going to get one. At least not from me.
Thank you.
But when your mama finds out you gave her praying,
This is starting to sound an awful lot like a sermon to me.
It's a simple Simon sermon.
I just don't understand how you can just say that you gave her praying just as easy as that. Is that an easy thing to do?
I'm not asking you to understand. I'm asking you to let me eat.
But I want to understand, don't you see? You can talk and eat at the same time. God knows you've been doing that your whole life. We all pray in this house.
Yes, we do.
And not just on the high holy days, neither like some of the families I could mention.
The Solomons.
Ooh.
The Taylors.
Yes!
The Riveras.
Just to mention a few.
That's enough from both of you. I don't have to explain anything to either of you. And I don't need a litany of all the under-observant Jews in Richmond. I stopped praying. I stopped believing. It's as simple as that.
That is anything but simple. If you ask, he will provide.
You don't think I asked? I did nothing but ask. For 4 years, I asked. He was silent.
War is not proof of God's absence. It's proof of his absence from men's hearts.
And God didn't start this war, Caleb. You did.
I did not start this war. I fought to defend my home.
Well, from the looks of things, you did a lousy job of it.
Don't you start with me on why this war was fought, John. You have no idea.
I think I may have an inkling.
Why? Because you've read about it? The Northern papers, the abolitionist pamphlets? Oh, yes, you've read all about it, haven't you? But you have no idea what this was. I do. I could tell you if you like. I've seen quite a bit these last 4 years. What have you seen? I was at Sharpsburg, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, and all the places in between and since. Where were you? I've seen plantations. Have you? I've seen slaves breaking their backs in the fields. When have you ever even broken a sweat? The only cotton you've ever touched is resting comfortably on your back right now. I don't need a lecture from you about what this was. I know better than you do. I know what slavery was. I saw it. I know what war is. I lived it. What did you see? What did you live? I was starving to death in Petersburg, and you were safe at home reading novels. Yes, reading, John. And you have my mother to thank for that, don't you forget.
I taught myself how to read. Your mama taught me A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and by the time she got to H, your father put a stop to it.
Because it was against the law.
I wonder if that was the reason. Already before she started teaching me, I was asking questions. Like, when was God going to save us like he did the slaves in Egypt? Or whether Nat Turner was our new Moses. That's when our lessons ended. But I kept reading. I pored over the books of the Torah. And I kept asking questions, if only to myself. You ever read Leviticus?
You know I have.
Then you'll remember this. Both thy bondman and thy bondmaid, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are round about you. Of them shall ye buy bondmen and bondmaids. They shall be your possession, and ye shall take them for your children to inherit for themselves. They shall be your bondmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule. You remember reading that?
Not enough to memorize it.
Certainly got me to thinking. Were we Jews or were we slaves? Were we the children of Israel or were we just the heathen that were round about you? Because we couldn't be both. That was clear. And now you say you've given up on praying just as easily as that. Because it was yours to discard if you wanted to. It was never ours. It was given to us and it could be taken away just by some careful reading of Leviticus.
Is your faith that weak, John? Can't answer one question and it all falls apart?
End of scene. Thank you. So as you can see, the relationships get to be very interesting because we have a young man who used to own slaves and the men who used to be his property. So it gets all roiled up with the topic of their faith, which they share. I'm going to get these panelists to weigh in on some of this. So, hi, Richard. Can you talk to us a little bit about what April of 1865 and the fall of Richmond and what that's like in the context of the history of Civil War?
Good grief.
You've got 2 minutes.
Yes. Folks write books about this. Well, there are all sorts of things that are happening in March and April. Richmond falls late in March. Abraham Lincoln visits. And the turnout among the slaves, or who are now freedmen, was passionate. The white Richmonders weren't too enthusiastic about his visit.
No.
And it was clear that the fall of Richmond, which involved a lot of burning, the retreating Confederate government and army decided that the Union shouldn't get hold of anything, particularly stored cotton. But once you start a fire in a city that is built largely of wood, it's not a good idea. So there was a conflagration, and as a consequence, much of Richmond, or at least downtown Richmond, is destroyed. And that's the sort of set-in for this. And of course, Lincoln, in a few days after his visit, is shot and killed. And that is the story that I think Eddie George comes back.
Yes, Simon does actually
Yes.
talk about having met Lincoln when
Yeah.
he stopped into Richmond.
So that's the context. That's April. That's the destruction of a city at the end of a war, a long and brutal war. A war by that time that much of the city had been suffering anyway because of it was under siege, it was under blockade. And you can tell by the fact that people are eating horses, dead horses. Dead kosher horses.
Sure.
So I mean, this is a terrible time to be in which to set a play, and I'm impressed that the author actually finds humor in it. But that was the context of Richmond at the time. April, And of course, all of these, the death of Lincoln, all of these things not only coincides with Passover, it coincides, of course, with Easter and
Right.
so it took on for many people a great kind of religious symbolism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's some of the themes that the author explores here anyway, although he takes a religious theme that nobody has really dealt with before. But it's all of those things. I mean, there were many sermons given in which people tried to make sense of the coincidence of High Easter, holy days, and the death and the assassination of the president at the end of a very brutal war.
Yeah. I think one of the things that, strikes anyone who gets to know this play, either through seeing it or reading it the first time, is not really having any concept of what the Jewish community in the American South, or what their role was and how that worked. So the question comes up, were there Jews who owned slaves? Were there Jewish slaves?
So yes, and yes.
All right, thank you very much. So,
and we're done. We have the Civil War and the South, the Jewish communities in the South are not necessarily proud. We are not necessarily the reenactors of the Civil War when people go about and do that. We would rather focus on 1965 than 1865 in our own histories. But there were Jewish communities that came about for over 350 years. We've been on these shores. So the Richmond Jewish community sort of started to flourish in the late 1700s. And the census that was taken in 1790 had about 400 Jewish souls. So that was only 4% of the white population at the time. That only grew to about 5%, not quite, by the time the Civil War took place. The Jews in the South were actually much more assimilated and acculturated than their northern counterparts. They were readily welcome into the community, although they did have some bigotry and anti-Semitism and racism, as it was called then too, that kept them from participating fully. But the Jews in the North and in the South loved being Americans, and so they tried to support their communities and their country however they knew how. So in the South, that meant that some of them did own slaves or household servants, because the majority of them overwhelmingly did not own land and did not own plantations. So there was one family that I found in Richmond's history that actually owned a plantation, and so they had a different number of household and other slaves. Most of them had just a few, if they could afford it at all, which was not very likely. Historically insignificant is what most of the research had proven. In terms of them being Jewish slaves, what I did find was in reading one of the charters for the synagogues, one of the earliest synagogues in Richmond, was that they had a charter for their membership, and their membership said that they could allow members who were free men, excluding slaves, which meant that some slaves wanted to join synagogues. And so that was something that I thought was significant, that they would be, and there was some reference to Jews in the synagogue. Now, the moral compass that we would like to find, and that we are embarrassed that maybe didn't happen earlier, was that in 1861, once the war began, you started to hear more about anti-slavery movements from the pulpit in Jewish congregations, North and South. There was a very famous duel between rabbis from the pulpit, one that was using the Bible to support the ownership of another human being, and a man named Rabbi David Einhorn, who publicly called him out and, line by line went through his sermon and said why that is morally unjust. And that was one of the first times you heard about civil rights in a Jewish context from the pulpit. So once the war began, the Jews found their voice, and they realized that they could have they could have a role in shaping the new America.
I was really interested in some of the conversation we'd had when we first started talking about this play about the ideas of the proper way to treat slaves as dictated by Judaism. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So in our story, and we'll get to this with the next scene too, the Israelites, in the Bible, in Exodus, the Israelites are enslaved for 400 years, and they are redeemed by God through Moses, according to the text. And they spend the next generations in the wilderness, and they have to figure out how to live their lives as good human beings in a new place in the promised land. these are people that were living in a slave context. So they were doing what people were doing in the ancient Near East. It doesn't justify it, but they were doing what people did in the ancient Near East. And so instead of outlawing the institution of slavery, as you had people, Israelite and non-Israelite, sort of going into indentured servitude in order to get themselves out of a difficult situation or to prosper, that's where you have some of those historical pieces in the text that talk about more the governance on the slave owner than, and for personal rights of the slave themselves. So the institution of slavery still exists in the Bible, but there are lessons that we learn from the Bible, from Exodus through Leviticus and beyond, including in Jewish history, about how you treat a slave that comes to work for you, Israelite and non-Israelite. And there are a few differences in there as well, which is sort of what we hear John talking about. Is he a slave or is he a Jew? But there's actually a middle ground there. There are people in our history that had put themselves into indentured servitude. So you have rules about not humiliating them, not beating them into submission. If you injure a slave, you have to restore it. You have to restore something to him. So you have to pay him, or you have to take care of him. You are actually mandated to let him go in certain cases. If you had relations, if a male had a relation with a female slave, he had to marry her. And if he wasn't going to marry her, she got freed. Oh. So the idea of the abuses that happen, at least according to the text, now we have laws against doing things because people were doing them, right? You don't have a law not to do something unless you know the behavior was existing. So this was a way to curb and govern how a slave owner would treat the people in his midst. So it was protecting their rights as human beings according to, observing the Sabbath, getting a day off, being able to take care of them that way, and observing Passover. Actually, if you had a slave in your household, they observed the Passover too. But it was more to control the slave owner, to make him act like a human being.
Right. And in this particular story, this is a relatively small household of slaves. It's Simon and John, who we actually meet in the course of the story. There's also reference to Simon's wife, Elizabeth, and his daughter, Sarah, who's the same generation with Caleb and John. And the titular character, the whipping man, is indeed someone who's not a part of their household. He's someone in the community that the slaves would get taken to get their whippings if they misbehaved. So he's sort of this specter, boogeyman kind of. If you don't be good, you get taken to the whipping man. And so I think that I think it's interesting that and there's a part of the story, I don't want to give it away, but there's a part of the story about how that gets handled when this family, takes John to the whipping man.
Right, and we don't know the faith of the whipping man.
Right.
So legally,
right,
you could probably get around it.
Because if he's not Jewish,
right,
then he can.
There's all, yeah.
But, But this is a character made up whole by the author of this play. There's no place where I have ever come across a character called a whipping man. No. If you were on plantations, there were overseers.
Yeah.
But there's nobody. He seems as though he's an institution to himself. He has. I suppose he's handing out little business cards that say. That say whipping man,
it's just an entrepreneur.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have some friends who would really want to go to the whipping man, but that's another story.
Either one of you, could you speak to the fact that there were Jewish Confederate soldiers and officers, right? I mean, they were, as opposed to in the Union Army, I mean, they were in both sides, basically?
Yeah, there were some. I know that you could do this better than I, but I know some of the stars of the Jewish Confederate. We're taught this because most of us don't learn a lot about Jewish history during the Civil War and their action, but there were a few that rose to some significant power, including Judah Benjamin, who basically became Secretary of State for the Confederacy. And so he was sort of the highest ranking Jewish officer, Jewish official that we had. But there were some other significant Jewish people, and even Lee there was a question that was posed to Lee about allowing furloughs for the high holidays. And the response was that he valued the Jewish soldiers, not that with or without them they may not succeed, But he valued the Jewish soldiers, but he sort of spoke more to their American or their Confederate value at that point, saying that you wouldn't want to, go into this half-hearted, we'd like you to still participate. So those were not his words, but that was the essence, was that he still asked them to participate. The furlough wasn't granted, but the question was interesting.
Yes, indeed. The next scene we're going to do for you is actually a little bit of the scene in which they actually celebrate a Seder dinner. Because resources are scarce, they sort of have to make do with the kinds of elements that are a part of the dinner itself. What's interesting about this scene, of course, has to do with the fact that we're talking about Simon is really the moral compass and the leader. He's the observant Jew who really insists, it's Passover, we're going to do a Seder dinner. And there's this lovely sort of fabulous echoing, this juxtaposition of the culture that they're in relative to their slavery in America, and how that story is reflected in the story told during the Seder. And we don't have enough time to do the whole thing, so we're just going to do a little piece of it. Gentlemen, if you will be so kind. So we're going to pick up kind of in the middle a little bit, but you'll just get a sense of how this author, how this playwright has sort of composed the Seder dinner in such a way that it is reflective of both of these cultures bouncing up against each other. It's very interesting, so off you go.
Behold the matzah, the bread of poverty, which our ancestors...
Whose ancestors?
Our ancestors.
Yes, sir.
Our ancestors ate in their affliction when they were slaves in the land of Egypt. Let all
who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are in need come celebrate Pesach. This year we are slaves. Next year may we be free. Next year we will be free. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. Ma, nishtana, halala hazeh. Miko Halilot.
You can't ask the question, Simon. That's my job.
I'm the youngest. I should ask.
I'll ask. I want to see if you have any answers for me. A child has questions. A man has answers. On all other nights, we eat leavened or unleavened bread. Why on this night are we eating this hardtack, Caleb?
Because our ancestors left Egypt in such a hurry, there was no time for the dough to rise. The first Seder was improvised, like ours.
Imagine that. John, on all other nights we eat all kinds of herbs. Why on this night do we only eat bitter herbs?
To remind us of the bitterness of slavery, as if we needed reminding.
Your children will, and their children will. We must not forget. Your children must be taught. Yours too, Caleb. On all other nights we do not dip any food in any other, even once. Why on this night do we dip twice, the celery and the salt water?
To remind us of the tears of slavery.
And if we had any haroset?
To remind us that sweetness can come from bitterness.
On all other nights we eat sitting up at the table. Why on this night do we recline?
Because rest is a symbol of the free man.
Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tonight, we celebrate the dream and the hope of freedom. The dream and the hope that had filled the hearts of men from the time of our Israelite ancestors went forth out of Egypt. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. People have suffered and sacrificed to make this dream come true. Father Abraham sacrificed. He sacrificed all he had. Father Abraham. Our American Moses led us from toil and bondage, but was not allowed to enter our promised land. Father Abraham, Father Abraham, Father Abraham.
That's right.
Yes, sir. Father Abraham gave his life to the struggle for freedom, and now we must dedicate ours. Though the sacrifice be great and the hardships many, we won't rest until the chains that enslave all men be broken.
Broken.
Let my people go. But being free means more than broken chains. You know that, right? It means freedom from anything that breaks your spirit or muddies your mind. Because there's more than one way a man can be a slave. You know that, right? How else? Come on now. How about you, John? How about all the drinking you've been doing, John?
What about it?
I know that money's your mind. You're a slave to your bottle. How about you, Caleb?
Simon, I don't know.
Sure you do.
I don't.
How about your lady? You're forever branded just like a slave. You're a slave to your old ideas. How deeply those enslavements have scarred the world. The wars.
Yes.
The destruction.
Yes.
The suffering. The waste.
My God, the waste.
Pesach calls us to be what?
Free.
Pesach calls us for freedom. Freedom.
Freedom.
That freedom ring in this house.
Yes, sir.
That freedom ring in this city. That freedom ring in this nation.
That's right.
Sing it with me.
Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go.
See? It's really it's really a stimulating idea to consider what it might have been like if indeed you were a practicing Jew and yet an American slave to observe Passover every year. Simon talks about how he's never missed a Seder, and this is the first time they're expressing ideas that actually are a part of their own lives. There was never a possibility that they would have been free in previous times. So I think that that's one of the things that stimulates all of our imaginations about that. Shannon, can you kind of tell us a little about the purpose of the Seder and how that works in the Jewish faith?
Sure. The Seder is told, the idea of seeing yourself as being a slave in Egypt and experiencing the redemption from slavery is told to us in the Bible, in Exodus, that we're supposed to reenact this and really see ourselves there. The purpose of doing that is to teach our children so that we don't forget. The historical memory of our people is what kept us alive throughout the generations, even in the darkest periods of our history. The idea of the redemption coming and the faith that you have in God, even in those moments, is something that kept us going. And with joy and with gratitude, even in those dark times as well. So the idea, it's a pedagogic tool. The Seder itself, it was fixed in the form that we do it today around the 2nd century, so that we could have 15 steps enumerated for us. Seder means order, and so there's an actual order to the dinner, and it's sort of like dinner theater, that you have steps that you take in order to tell the story. But the Seder really is a night of questions, and it's if you hear this play, all you hear are these questions. Why is this night different than all other nights? Why do we do this? Why am I experiencing this? And so even in slavery, you're supposed to act as if you're a free man. So the idea of reclining, only free people get to eat while they recline. And you have condiments on the table, so you're dipping things. And people that aren't free don't necessarily have those things on their table. So the idea of asking questions is so important. But something else that happens during the Seder is that we talk about 4 children. The wise, the wicked, the one who is simple, and the one who doesn't even know enough to ask. And at all times throughout our lives, we are one of those children, if not multiples of those children, that we're very smart in certain ways, and we're wicked, which just means you don't see yourself in the story any longer. And some of those characters go through that, through the evening, through the play. They don't see themselves in their roles. And the simple ones, you have to just give them the plain answer. Why are we doing this? Because we're taught to do this, and we do this through the generations. So I like how the characters become each and every one of those wise, wicked is the questioning one, and the simple, and even the one that doesn't know how to ask. So the purpose of the Seder is to teach our children, and you meet them where they are with those answers. You give them that comfort of knowing that they'll get what they need to get out of this conversation. The Seder gives us that opportunity to teach our children the lessons through a very sensory experience of sights, sounds, tastes for sure, and experiences. So everything is symbolic on the Seder plate to talk about our slavery and the freedom. And there's a moment with the charoset, which is a very sweet mixture of nuts and apples and cinnamon and wine, which they clearly don't have, which is so interesting. You know, Simon says, if we had charoset, what would it mean? And this is something that's so interesting, is that they have the freedom, they just got that freedom, but they can't taste it yet. And so the questions that they ask throughout the play it's sort of anticipating, just like the Israelites in Exodus are anticipating the wandering in the wilderness to get to the promised land. That's exactly what these folks are doing on the stage. They have no idea what's coming next. It is a whole bunch of wilderness until they get to where that promised land, and the promised land is different for each of them. So it's an interesting tool. This is, I think, a brilliant way of looking at this story.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say, do you think, Richard, that over the generations that that slaves did tend to adopt the faith of their owners, just historically speaking, not just Jewish, but I mean just generally speaking?
Yes, I think
Yeah.
so. I mean, if religion is an opiate,
Yeah.
then I suspect people did. But because outside of the rituals that Shana explained so well, I suspect that if we had shifted our focus to a Baptist household, at this time in Richmond history in April of 1865, one could anticipate similar sorts of conversations in different, obviously using different ritual traditions. Right. But so this idea of freedom and liberation and liberty after coming out of this dark period for so long it's there. It's a staple of the Bible. Right. So one would anticipate that people would be saying similar sorts of things in a different language, obviously, and with different traditions.
Well, then, as you alluded to before, Easter was also falling at this time, so there's a universality of that.
Even the non-Jewish slaves, which was the majority anyway, they co-opted the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and the spiritual that they were singing, we've taken back into our own Seders in modern days, and so many of us sing it at our Seder today, the Go Down Moses. We sing that, Let My People Go, because it encapsulated so beautifully in that spiritual what the message of the Exodus story was. So even if they weren't Jewish slaves, they found a universal message of freedom and dignity and redemption, ultimate redemption, in the story that itself.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons this play has been so appealing sort of across the board, because it really sort of asks that universal question of what role does faith play in your ability to see yourself as a human being and how you practice your morality and all those sort of relative questions that make it a really rich texture of conversation. We have one more scene to share with you. And I need to set it up just a little bit. It takes place close to the end of Act 1. As I mentioned, we are aware that Simon has a wife and a daughter, Elizabeth and Sarah, who we learned from early in the play that the whole household is vacated because of the destruction going on in Richmond. So Caleb's mom has gone off to be with her mom, and Caleb's father has taken Sarah and Elizabeth with him, and they're all really kind of in this waiting mode to see who's going to come back, when can they come back, when the destruction and the fires have all died down and stuff. They're waiting for their families to come back. And so this is going to be, again, just close to the end of Act 1. So gentlemen, if you will be so kind.
Why is Freddie Cole looking for you? Did he do that to your hand?
No, I cut it.
On what?
Piece of glass.
Breaking into a home?
Maybe.
Maybe you should have Simon look at it.
Maybe you should worry about your own wounds.
Maybe the people who you robbed would want to know what you've been up to.
If you could find them.
Maybe my father would like to know what you've been up to.
Maybe you'd like to know what he's been up to.
You know something you're not telling me?
Let me see your pardon.
But
Your pardon. Officers and soldiers at Appomattox were paroled. If you were there like you said, you'd have a pardon. Piece of paper. Something. Where is it?
it's hidden.
Where?
I'm not telling you.
Show it to me.
No.
Why not?
Because it's mine.
You know what I think?
I don't care what you think.
I think you weren't anywhere near Appomattox. I think you surrendered long before the rest of your army did. I think you're a deserter.
You can think whatever you want.
I bet I can prove it too. It's why you didn't want to go to the hospital, isn't it? You go there, people gonna figure out your story. So you have your surgery here. Have Simon care for your wounds. Get your food. Oh, and of course hide you if anyone comes looking for you. That about sum it up?
You certainly are the expert on having Simon hide you from people who are looking for you, aren't you, John? And even if what you're saying were true, what difference does it make now? The war's over.
And your side lost. And you weren't there when it happened. What about the men you abandoned? The men you were responsible for leading, Captain De Leon? Deserting the army is one thing, but you deserted your men. They'll hang you from the nearest branch the second they find you.
I'm home now. Even if they come here, Simon wouldn't give me up.
What if Simon wasn't here?
Where would he go?
Let's say he goes off looking for Sarah and Elizabeth.
Why would he do that? They're with my father. What? John? But tell me, goddammit!
They're gone.
They're with my father.
No, they are not. They are gone.
Gone where?
Sold.
You're lying.
Your mother was gone. Simon was gone, and he sold them.
No, that's not possible.
Of course it is. He owned them. He could sell them if he wanted to.
He wouldn't have.
Why not?
Because?
Because we're family?
No, that's not possible. Not Sarah, not Elizabeth.
I
no.
saw it with my own eyes. Watched them taken away in chains. Caleb, they are gone.
Why would he do that?
You can't think of a reason, Caleb? Why your father might not want Sarah in the house anymore?
Did you tell my father?
No.
Did you tell my father?
I didn't have to. When was the last time you were home on leave?
I don't remember.
September, 7 months ago. Things started to become quite apparent in that time.
What are you saying?
You know what I'm saying.
Sarah is.
Sarah is.
Oh, God, Sarah. She must have been so scared. This is my fault. This is all my fault. Sarah. My Sarah.
Your Sarah.
Why did he do it?
Well, he is a prominent man, and people do talk.
Who bought them?
A traitor, heading out west away from the Federals.
He had to know the war was coming to an end.
He didn't sell them for much.
You've known all this time and you said nothing.
What do I owe you?
What do you owe Simon? We have to tell him. He has to know. Simon! Simon, get in here!
He'll leave the second you tell him.
He has to know.
And then you're here, alone and helpless.
Would you?
Well, I would.
You would leave me here like this?
I would leave you much worse.
What are we going to do?
We are not doing anything. We are not saying anything.
But Sarah...
If you tell Simon, he will leave. And when Simon leaves, I leave. That I promise. And then you're on your own. And you will die. Can you feed yourself? Clean your own wound. Hide yourself from any soldiers who might be out there looking for you. Can you do that? We wait like we have been. We'll let your father tell Simon when he gets home. If he gets home.
They'll be long gone by then.
They're long gone already.
Caleb, you wanted something?
Nothing, Simon. I'm sorry.
And curtain. Yeah, so one of the things that the playwright was really interested in exploring is the aftermath of the big thing. In other words, after you're free, what do you do then? And so I would love it if you could talk about a couple things. One is the politics around white slave owners impregnating slaves, and also then that transitional period out of slavery into freedom, what that was like for them.
You asking me to talk about sex?
Yeah, baby.
Well, here goes. It's a common feature of slavery. In fact, it's, I think, the ultimate expression of power. And in slavery, slave masters regularly had relationships with their slave women. And one of the ironies of the consequences of that is that because of slave laws, any offspring of that relationship is a slave, because slavery is transmitted through the mother and not through the father. Most probably it's the only thing in Western civilization that isn't transferable through the man. So it is a regular, I mean, if you read accounts of plantation mistresses or even of former slaves, one of those frequent tense moments on plantations is when the slave mistress recognizes in the little child running around the plantation her husband. That, I mean, if you think about it, that must be the most horrendous thing. If you look up and see your husband in the face of a little kid running around. And as a consequence, what many mistresses did was to give away those children, either to their daughters after their marriage and things like that. So it becomes a real thorn in the side of, and a real tense situation in the slave master's home.
Right.
But it was. I don't know. I mean, I can't put a figure to the amount of times that it happened, but it happened regularly, and it is one of those things in plantation societies. In American plantation society and slave societies, and something that continued well after slavery, is this absolute fear and abhorrence of interracial sex. And the great perpetrators of interracial sex were the ones who screamed loudest about it, and who feared people of mixed race, and who came up with some of the most bizarre theories of the fact that mixed race people can't reproduce themselves by the fourth generation. So you have this a big sort of ideological justification that tries to show that one of the things that has to be avoided at all time is interracial relationship. So that coupled with issues of race is this fearful kind of sexual fear of the consequences of any kind of relationship. You know, and it's still to some extent pervades American society today. I mean, I still remember the election of 2008 when people were trying to make a virtue out of the fact that Obama was an interracial child. I mean, but he was still black, but he was somehow, it was something that, you know, happened there. But what folks don't realize is that if he wasn't born in Hawaii, both his mother and father would have been locked up in Kansas because it was illegal. So there's a terrible fear that pervades slave society, and it exists well after.
Yeah. There's actually a conversation in this play later on when when Caleb says, "I love her," Simon says, "You own her." So it's a textured relationship, shall we say.
It's a line that doesn't go down well in my house at all.
I'm hoping that we can have a few moments for some questions and answers here, but before we do that, we have a couple of tickets to give away. Here comes Kristen Dare Horsley. You must be present to win. I felt that way when I was watching the SAG Awards.
They should be present to win.
All right, Alberta Montgomery. Present. She's present. Yay. Everybody applaud for Alberta. She's going to come see my show. All right, so we're here to field any questions you might have, but you'll have to be really brave and stand up and talk really loud. So questions or comments for anybody on the panel or one of the actors? We're all yours. Uh-huh. Yes, ma'am.
I never got a clear answer. Did slaves who were not Jewish, did they actually convert completely? I mean, as in a rabbi made them Jewish?
Yeah.
Or, I mean, a rabbi
Poof.
said that they were
Yeah.
Jewish or not? I'm kind of getting that they adopted it, but not necessarily that they...
Yeah, well, we're told in the Torah that any of the servants that or bondsmen or women that came into the household should have been circumcised. So the men would have been circumcised. So that would, in essence, be their conversion in ancient days. So according to the Bible, that was true. And there's a conversation in the Talmud, the rabbinic literature, about whether or not you should try to convert or engage someone who comes into your household as a bondsman or a woman into the faith. So there is conversation about it, and I don't know for sure how many would have. I mean, it stands to reason that the faith of the family would extend to the servants. And in terms of what Jewish law says now, the practice may have been different, but according to what Jewish law said, there was a certain level of treatment that should have happened and a certain level of leeway that was given, certain rights that the slaves had in a Jewish household that they may not have had in a non-Jewish household. But again, the numbers are so small that I don't know for sure what the practice would have been, although we do have record in the Bible of people coming into households, and by virtue of a circumcision for a male, that would convert them. So it stands to reason that it could have happened.
Good question. Anybody else? Oh, there you go. Speak right up.
Within the context of this play and of the historical period, we're not talking about biblical history. We're talking about these men and the household in which they live. And the De Leon family, we may imagine, has been living in the South for quite a long time.
Yeah, they probably came, that name comes from the Spanish-Portuguese immigration.
Those folks and their ancestors had been in Richmond and in the area presumably for quite a long time. So based on the laws that were in effect then, it's entirely possible that these men and their ancestors had been in the same household for quite a long time. Within that context, is it not possible that they were circumcised in infancy and had always been raised as Jews, particularly based on Simon's statement that he had never missed a Seder?
Right.
You know, the conversation here has been that they came into the household and decided, oh, yeah, I want to be Jewish like the master.
Right.
But conversion to Judaism isn't as simple as conversion to many other more or less modern Western religions, where you say, I believe in a little water and bingo bango.
Right. Well, because it's not as safe to convert to Judaism. I mean, there's a reason for that.
But I think
yeah,
I was just going to say, you're right, though. This play does tell the story of sort of a generational experience with adopting the faith over time.
Sure. So the question was, it seems like there would have been an intergenerational relationship between the slaves that were owned by the De Leon family and the De Leon family themselves, and would they not have been raised fully as Jewish if that was really the case? The truth is that you cannot convert under duress, and if you are not a free person, how much freedom do you have to actually make that decision? So that's the debate that happens in the Talmud that I think is relevant even today, even though this conversation was medieval. The question is, if you are owned by another human being who has a faith in their household, how do you then say, I don't want to be that faith? Right? So even until they are free people, they cannot say with accord that they are Jewish, right, and affirm it themselves. So that's the question that I have as a rabbi, saying if they are not free, how are they then free to make that decision? So there is that question, although there are people that are incarcerated all the time that aren't free that make those decisions too. So my own perspective is that there are no records of any Jewish slave owners who raised Jewish slaves. So what I did mention in the beginning was that there is a synagogue that mentioned only free people could belong, which meant that there were slaves that were Jewish who wanted to join a congregation. So that, and there were some congregations that they did join. This one in particular that I read, the charter, they didn't allow it in 1790.
But if you think of the first generation of slaves in the United States or anywhere in the Americas, somebody who comes from Africa and is plunked down in the middle of a slave household, and by the time he is done to go and meet his maker, he is a Christian. Now that is weird. How did you get there? And what are the tensions that existed between a Christian religion and one's African religion? What kind of synchronization takes place? What sort of changes people undergo? Why are churches in the South, for instance, segregated in the 18th and 19th century? And why then do black people found their own denominations as a way to express their freedom? So religion by its very nature becomes a way it is both a way of control and also ultimately a way of providing a means towards emancipation. So it has a tension in its religion by its very nature, whatever religion it is, has that tension in a system of slavery. You can't be fully free and you can't be fully enslaved in that sense. So it is conversions, converting to a religion. I expect that the majority of slaves by the second generation had never converted to any religion, Baptist, Methodist, whatever. It just happened by osmosis. You know, you hang around it and it just filters into your system. I mean, I was raised Catholic and that's how it was. I mean, I don't know what the hell's going on. I mean, you know, I follow my parents to church and I do things and the ritual is there, but I can't remember any. I know I was baptized, but I can't remember any conversion. What did you call it? Bang, boom, bang, some strange noise. That's the best description of conversion I've ever heard.
Well, I think that one of the wonderful things about this particular play as a work of art is that it does explore this tension between emancipation and enslavement. And it's really a great story, and I really hope that you will come and see it in its entirety. We'd love to see you there. We're at the end of our time. I want to say a big thank you to our panelists, a big thank you to Kristen and Gail, big thank you to these wonderful actors.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
And we'll see you at the theater. Thanks.